Hello everyone, MasterZeon1201 here. In this update log for Boxcutter 718_9, we'll be going over some of the changes that have happened for this version of Boxcutter. For the most part, it's a pretty small update. However, the update to the mini helper, now upgraded to the box helper, was a pretty massive update, and we'll be getting a dedicated video on its own where I'll be going over it a little bit more in depth. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in and talk about what's new in Boxcutter 718_9. So whenever it comes to Boxcutter, its intended usage method is actually going through the top bar and choosing your shape and going through and setting up which cutter you want and being able to intricately adjust your settings as you need them. Of course, you can go in and choose your start state for your modifier, but alternative to that, you could press D, and D will bring up the pie menu. Now, the pie menu for Boxcutter has basically remained unchanged. However, over time, we wanted to attempt to make some changes to try to update and make it a little bit more flexible for users' needs. And that's where, if we expand the behavior drop down and we go under display, we have an option for simple pie. And basically, by enabling simple pie under input, we can press D and it will allow us to have a simpler pie menu where basically we have circle, box, N-gon, and custom, and then there's wedge. However, in conjunction with D for your pie menu, there's always been Control D, which brings up the miniature helper. The goal of the mini helper is to assist users with doing things on the fly, reducing the amount of different hotkeys that would have to be used by allowing you to quickly wedge and taper and mark it as persistent and change your shape on the fly if needed. So the Control D has always been thought of as a assistant, a helper of sorts whenever it comes to Boxcutter. But for this release, we have definitely changed the way that these things are done. And so if we go under display, we see an option for simple helper, which refers to the helper I was just showing on Control D. If we turn it off, we are now using the new helper. And so by pressing Control D, we can actually see the new box helper. The idea behind it was to make it similar to the HardOps helper. When we press Control tilde in HardOps, we have this glorious helper that lists all our modifiers and various workflow things we can adjust on the fly. So the goal was to give Boxcutter that same level of helper, but catered towards the needs of Boxcutter. Now, the thing about the helper is that over the course of its development, we found that it became so useful that it actually became essential to possibly allow it to even be mappable to D. So currently I can press D and it's my pie menu, and then we press Control D and it's the new helper. So this is the previous way that Boxcutter was configured. However, you can go under the input tab under the behavior dropdown and enable D key for the helper. I'll also take this time to enable alternative extrude. And from here, when we press D, we now have the box helper and we're now ready to begin talking about this. So now that we've went under our behavior sprocket and we went under input and turned on our D key helper, and went under display and turned off simple helper, that means that now when we press D, we get the new box helper. So to show in action why this is a little bit easier to use, we are currently in circle and we have our circle panel where we can choose our resolution of our circle. We can expand the subpanel and actually type in specifically how many segments we want on our circle, or we can just click the quick options to get a very particular type of resolution on our circle. We can change our type from polygon to modifier to star to 3 variants of circle, all within this nice little slider. So let's go ahead and just draw a circle. So now we're drawing a circle. I'm going to take a moment and press tab in order to pause this shape. From here, we can press D and we bring up our helper. Now our helper is actually specially catered for us drawing a circle. That means that instead of our dimensions showing X, Y, and Z, we actually have only the diameter. Keep in mind with any of these dimension fills that you can simply just type in something like 22 inches, press enter, and it will simply scale it to that size. Let's set it to something like 2 feet, 2 FET, press enter, and we can also adjust the Z depth. Another thing about it is we have access to the corner and origin dimensions during draw, which we can also change. However, I'll be going over that more in depth later. And that's really just the basics of using the mini helper to quickly get in and deal with something like the circle. If we click on bevel, we've now added a bevel to our shape, and we can actually move our mouse off to begin adjusting the bevel. If we roll the wheel, we can give this one segment. We can press tab and pause it. From here, press D and bring our helper back up. If we click on the helper to collapse it, as far as the bevel slider goes, we can see that the bevel slider has an option for us to flip the bevel. So if we click on that, we see that we're able to quickly jump to a reverse bevel without any delay or need to press the hotkey. So let's right click, let's just draw a circle, let's press B to bevel, press tab, press D, click on the reverse bevel button, and there we are quickly just reverse beveling with the circle. So really it's that easy. If you click on the option or the name or even the expand icon, you can get access to additional options and also the quick prefs that are actually associated with each of the particular prefs that have preset systems attached. So we went through a great deal to give all of our tools a ability to shine. Another thing, for example, is let's press D, switch over to box, and let's just draw a box. We can just draw our box out and we'll press tab to pause it. One of the new features of Boxcutter recently was the ability to turn it into a grid. If we just click on the icon for grid, we see that we have now turned this box into a grid, and because of auto solidify, which is part of box grid, we have a solidify modifier that we're also able to dynamically adjust within the helper, just allowing users to quickly get used to something like box grid. On the side is also wedge, which we're able to click wedge and toggle it off and on. Same thing with taper. We can activate taper and get in and quickly adjust the presets. By giving it 1, we're able to just quickly remove taper. Whenever it came to requesting this particular menu, Boxcutter wasn't built in a fashion for it to be given such a helper. However, I did request to at least try, and through our attempts we were able to get it to this level. However, I can definitely tell you that Boxcutter was not built for this as far as its initial plan. However, it's definitely going to become part of its future. So we're talking about how we're able to deal with the various modifiers on the side, toggle them off and on, just like that. These modifiers are referred to as like shape modifiers, so they're kind of exclusive to each particular shape. If we right click and we press D, we see that we have our shape listing back, but the moment that we begin drawing, these options actually go away. So let's choose Ngon, and we see that Ngon doesn't actually have a box grid option. If we click on custom, we see that custom doesn't have one either. If we click on box, we see that grid is only exclusive to box, and that's actually part of the way that it was made. If we click on circle, we see that circle has a variant of star, and that's just how users are able to just quickly get around these things without having to go through any other supplemental submenus or special panels of Boxcutter. So really in action, this thing is just poetry. So let's look at Ngon. So right here we have Ngon activated. A popular question with users is, how do I draw an Ngon line? Well, there's an option right here where you can just simply just turn an Ngon into a line, meaning that whenever you draw, you are actually drawing an Ngon line. And what this means is that if we were to right click to pause by ending our last point, we can press D and we have an option for solidification, which can be adjusted. We can also begin just control scrolling over the extrude to give this some extrusion, or just begin clicking and dragging it in order to give it some extrusion. So the helper, even in its hacked state of the way that we put it together, allows a degree of versatility that Boxcutter has never had with the previous helper. In fact, the way that it was before, it was getting really stuffed with options. There wasn't really a lot of room we could go through. Another area I want to talk about is radial array. So if we just use our dots and we just jump off the center dot and we just perform an extrusion and pause, we can press D and let's just click on array. So now we have an array, and if we move the mouse, we're able to adjust this array, even though we're also able to do it with the helper still up. But we'll press tab to just pause this array, and we'll press the helper, in which we have options to choose which axis we're actually arraying on, as well as the distance, and you can even control scroll over the count in order to adjust the count on the fly, or just click and drag to adjust your count. But the best part of it is that this circular icon allows you to quickly jump into a radial array. And so once you're in this, you see that the rest of the options have changed, allowing you to adjust your distance and count quickly on the fly. And this is actually probably the best way that we've created to approach radial array, compared to pressing V and V inside of Boxcutter. And really, with this, we are just scratching the tip of the iceberg. If we press D, we can jump over to Ngon. Ngon has multiple variants. For example, we talked about turning it into a line, but we also have the ability to turn it into a lasso. So just by clicking lasso, you're able to just turn this into a lasso. It'll let you know that you're a lasso, meaning that if we're in orthographic view and we just begin clicking and dragging, we're drawing a lasso cut. But the best part is that if you go over and you toggle the line behavior, you can also draw an lasso cyclic shape, and this is something that we want accessible to all users off the bat. These shouldn't be hidden tips. This is something that we feel should be something that any user who takes it out the box should be able to get acquainted with. So over time, as we gauge the approval of the mini helper, it more than likely will either become our default, or we'll make adjustments to either shrink it down or grow it out to its final plan and final form to actually make it the thing that we envisioned it to be. But really, this was the best stopping point for this V1 to begin introducing it to users, because so much work has gone into this and it's been really months into planning. But I'll be doing a supplemental video going over this more in depth later in the ideology behind each and every one of these sliders. However, with that, we'll move on to the next area. So whenever you're working in Boxcutter, you have your cutters collection where your cutters are being placed. So whenever I just click and drag and begin doing cuts, these cutters are actually being placed in the cutters collection. If we press D and we bring up the mini helper, we can actually click on the collection color, and whenever we change the collection color, we see that it actually changes it in real time. Previously, Boxcutter didn't actually do this, but it is nice sometimes whenever you're working to just change your collection color just on the fly to just something random. I don't know, sometimes I just have it yellow just on the side just so I see it more vividly, but it's just a quality of life improvement. I'm glad to see it added to Boxcutter. So to set up a situation for knife, we will press D, and using circle and polygon and 32, we will just click and drag and create a few circles. And as you see on the wireframe, whenever it comes to Blender and Booleans, they will just solve as they will whenever it comes to finding the nearest edge and which edge of the circle it will choose to connect with. However, if we press D and we switch over to box, we can change over to knife, and we see that we have an option for hops mark, which we'll be talking about. But knife in essence is used to be able to basically assist your geometry with how it solves whenever it comes to Booleans. I mean, this is normally the primary use I have for it, is basically drawing boxes and allowing it to assist with the solving to alleviate the stress that normally comes with the bevel on unsolved geometry. In fact, for this box, I'll need to press G and move things. But after clicking and applying, we see that this now solves a lot better whenever it comes to these circles and their relationship with the surface, meaning that if I were to add a bevel, I'm actually able to bevel this successfully. The alternative negative reality is us pressing Q and cleaning the mesh, which put us back where we started, and we see these cute little edges on the corners, which is simply unacceptable. So we'll just press Ctrl Z and we see the result compared to what we were just looking at as something definitely much more desirable. A few things to keep in mind whenever it comes to using Blue Box is it definitely can get a little bit slow. Blue Box is doing intersections in edit mode and then returning you to object mode in real time. So while it looks like it's something that's happening in object mode, it's definitely an edit mode oriented operation, so it can definitely be quite heavy. Now the next thing is, if you have hops enabled, you'll have the option for hops mark, which will basically mark the edges that you draw with 3D Box using the same settings as you have in Control tilde under your HardOps sharp option. So if we press D, we see that the option that would normally be delegated to Shift K is now something that you can just toggle on by default, removing the need of having to press that hotkey. So if we just click and drag, we can now draw a 3D box, and if we tap into edit mode, we see that that edge has been selected and basically marked sharp. We can draw another one, and we see that the same thing has actually happened with this one as well. And that's just basically now how easy it is for users to be able to just get in quickly and to start hop smart sharpening their edges. Initially, this was added for me to be able to use what quad remesher as a way to override and draw in geometry that would be used for overriding. However, it definitely has some other uses outside of that which are definitely quite interesting, but just wanted to let users know that the switchblade for it has now been removed, so you can now enable it, use it consistently, and it'll no longer turn itself back off. Normally, whenever box cutters used, your shapes will come in drawn like this whenever you're drawing a cut. You can press H and it will turn it into a wire shape, which in this update we've done some changes with the ability to display live status. So whenever you're pressing L to toggle between live shapes and non-live, you'll now have feedback even if you're in a wire state, which was something that wasn't previously available. However, the thing of note is that normally your shapes come in with a color tint indicating the operation, along with a black border. However, if we were to press Ctrl K to use the HardOps helper for displaying preferences and go to the Boxcutter side, we can actually look at the Boxcutter side without having to bring up our preferences. And if we look at wire, we see that there's an option. On the other side, we'll actually use the mode of the color to shade the outer border of the wire. So now you see that we're drawing a red shape with a red wire. If we were to press D and just switch over to slice, we're able to draw a yellow shape with a yellow border, which at first we thought seemed like a pretty good idea. With intersect, orange border with the orange shape, that intersect cuts out the shape. But really, it's something that you can change at your own whim just by going under your color preferences and just toggling off the toggle for use mode at the opposite side of wire inside of your preferences, but just letting users know that there are options for you to change your color display type on the fly. However, I've already returned back to the default because it is my favorite. Whenever it comes to circle inside of Boxcutter, we can just press D and bring up our mini helper to jump over to circle, and we see that we're already in polygon and we have options for jumping between 3 all the way up to 64. However, if we expand it, we also have the ability to type in any amount that we want. So normally our soft limit was set to something like 64 or 128 before. Now we've increased it for 512 for those mad lads who are making spaceships that just need to make astronomical circles. You're now able to inside of Boxcutter without any further ado, but just keep in mind that adding 512 vert circles is adding 512 verts of, oh my god, this is 512 verts, how is this modifier going to process all this? But it is now possible inside of Boxcutter. Just one of those things I wanted to get dealt with while we were dealing with all the Control D business, and I'm just happy to announce that you can now add higher resolution circles. In conclusion, I'll say that this Boxcutter update will probably be one of the biggest updates to Boxcutter yet. Despite it having the smallest release log on a visual level, so much has happened as far as trying to compact everything into a smaller UI to try to give it upfront to all users, that basically the video explaining it is me basically explaining the entirety of Boxcutter almost. So in lieu of that, we'll cut this release log a little short because it's already going to have an extended section going over everything more in depth. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump to that, and I'll wrap this video and see you guys next time.